Welcome back and welcome, Devin. What's going on?
Same as a couple minutes ago,
You
except
know,
a little older, a little crankier.
a little older and a little cranky. I get that. One of the things that we were talking about, obviously, is what session you're going to go through. First thing I would really like to do, so people can get a taste of exactly how crazy this session sounds. Can you do me a favor and press play just for about 30 seconds? Give us a taste. So let's talk about what was this song about first?
I think every album, as I was saying about the material that I'm writing in the quarantine time here as well, is based loosely on my life, of course, because I can draw influence from that. But every record since the beginning has had a trajectory to it that has been consistent in that I think there is a fascination that I've had with the universe at large, I suppose. And as life progresses, you end up evolving yourself. And Empath is just the next album in a long line of that concept. Evermore in particular, I don't know. I think it's probably fair to say that every song is just a reaction to what's going on, and Empath was just a bunch of words that seem to resonate with that particular period.
I love
I
this
don't know,
song. Okay, so
probably
let's go through some stuff. So where do you want to start? You want to start? Where do you start when you're working on a session, specifically one of your own? Do you start once you, regardless of recording, when you're actually getting to the mixing stage? Where do you start? Do you start at the drums, or do you start at the vocals, or anywhere specific?
I started the drums, and I think maybe a good way to begin this session as well is for me to give an overview of how these sessions are structured.
Beautiful.
I think the biggest thing that is required for me to produce, mix, engineer, as well as perform and write the music is to maintain some sense of discipline between your left brain and your right brain. And what I mean by that is on a creative level, there is a benefit to being very free and very random in terms of how you just vomit this stuff out and pick a track at random and just start slamming things down. But by the time you get to the mix stage, where yes, I do start with the drums, it's important for me to structure these sessions so they're logical. So I color them, of course, and I start with drums, and then beats, then bass, then guitars, and then as it moves down, I then go to orchestrations and then samples. And then I go to the vocals. And if you see in the vocals, in this case, it's all the orange ones. It's just uh, immense amounts of vocals. And then by the time I get to the bottom, vocal effects, choirs, chickens next, dirt bikes.
Did
And
you
then,
say dirt bikes?
yeah, there's a dirt bike in here. Of course, brother. How could we
Everywhere.
not? How could we make a session without Cam's dirt bike here? Right. And what I think is interesting about being able to discuss these sessions is every aspect of this is the result of typically either another session or another um, uh, studio experience. Like that dirt bike was recorded by a friend of mine outside in the alley where they own this dirt bike store, right? So I think that if you look at these vocals, as much as there is immense amounts of vocals here, these also represent multiple sessions.
Right.
Submixing is a huge part of my process. So by the time I get to the end where we're at now, there's so many tracks, but at least there's a semblance of logic to it, right? It's condensed somewhat.
I'm still at the chicken and the bike.
Chicken,
The bike kind of gave me a flashback to Meatloaf there for a second.
chicken for you, Mike.
Ah, thanks, mate.
There we go. Peacock. All right.
Every chicken should sounds better with reverb on it. Okay, so talking about effects, where do you come? I mean, it's like at what point do you go? You know what this song needs? A chicken.
I think, I was talking to my wife about this yesterday because she likes to paint, but she doesn't consider herself an artist. And I was trying to convince her that I don't think being an artist is an actual, uh, uh, it's not an actual thing that you can't learn, I believe. And I think what I mean by that is in order to be an artist, in my estimation, you have to follow the creative inclinations wherever they go. So when it comes to effects, for me, I will just take a thread. I might think, okay, well, here it needs to feel like it's a more explosive emotion, or here it needs to feel like it's more subdued or creepy, or whatever emotion you can tack an adjective onto, and then I follow that randomly. And sometimes it leads me down pathways that are useless, and then you just scrap that work. But other times it leads you to things that then lead to something else, and you just follow that. And vocal effects, I don't even know. Listening through to some of these, let's hear what I've got here. Yeah, this. So basically, that was not an idea that I was following. It was a happy accident. I had done in slip or in shuffle mode in Pro Tools, I had made during the arrangement process copies of the verse. I wanted to see what it would feel like if the verse extended twice or three times or whatever it was. And during that process, I happened upon a little cut of one of my vocal tracks that did that. So what I did was I thought, well, that would be really cool as a motif throughout the song because it changes tempo wise. If you listen to the actual track here, there's a skip on the beat. So it's like, actually, that's actually is not the best description of that skip on the beat. Okay, so let's see. Excuse me just for a second. And so that vocal effect in the background began to establish itself as a tether to something. So even though the beat is confusing is not the right word, but it's got something that is atypical. Having that vocal just constantly be something that if you're listening to, you can just sort of focus on that became really an intriguing aspect of it. And so I took that little clip of vocals and then I did fades on either end of it. So it wasn't, it didn't have those artifacts in it. And then I filtered it because a lot of how I find a sonic space within a mix this dense is to find frequencies that aren't being taken up by other things, right? And of course, that's the technique. But specifically with something like this, if we listen to the top of the song here, you'll see that motif start. It's like, not the top here, so where's the top for future reference? Right there. Okay. So that became something that was really intriguing to me creatively, because it meant that I could sort of make the complications of the instrumentation something that was left of center. But while you're listening, you've still got that sort of internal sense of 4/4, right? So that's an example of a vocal effect, and how that occurred was simply a fluke.
I'm just in awe right now. Your sessions sound so good. On that note, Daniel says, Devin, you've been one of the most influential musicians I've ever followed. Thank you for the music you make, and please don't stop making more. The question is, you have a voice powerful enough to stop a freight train in its tracks. How in the world do you use that vocal gift without destroying your throat? E.g., for example, Deadhead.
Well, smoke and mirrors, I guess, would be the best and easiest description of how I maintain it. I was talking to a good friend about singing yesterday, and I've done this set recently where I've done a retrospective of the career throughout strapping, DTP, Ziltoid, casualties, all these things that I've done that have required different vocal techniques. I only became a singer because singers in general, when I was auditioning them as a kid, drove me bananas. I just always found that um, the psychological aspects of every musician seems to be hand in hand with what the instrument is meant to do. So I've found, not to generalize, but I find that people who are drawn to drums have a certain mindset, maybe not mindset, but a certain way of processing music overall. And guitar players, bass players, and singers very much, because you have to sort of rend yourself for the audience, because your emotional baggage in a lot of ways is just so upfront, that comes with these psychological ramifications that are difficult, or at least can bring out a certain thing. And so I found with singers, I was like, God, I don't want to have to deal with that. So like the old adage, as opposed to dealing with douchebags, you just become that douchebag, right? And so I never learned how to sing in any sense other than, well, my objective emotionally is to reach that level. And so I will find a way by force of will more than anything else to do it. That's what it's become. And so singing for me is also the source of a lot of stress, because never learning how to do it properly, it's completely random as to whether or not my voice is going to work. So maybe the person who's making this comment has seen me on the nights that it has worked, but there's been other people that would say, "Man, I don't know. I saw that guy and he shit the bed with huge amounts of triumph." Right? I don't know, man. Thank you, though. I really appreciate it.
I'm writing that phrase down. Shits the bed with. Okay, beautiful. All right, so
Go back to sleep.
while we're taking a couple of questions. Hi, Devin. This is from Pablo.
Hey.
My question is, what is essential to you when creating something new, and how do you achieve it? For instance, to be alone in the studio when it comes to your state of mind right now.
A lot of it is discipline. And what I mean by discipline is not necessarily in line with the musical side of it. Sure, there's a certain amount of discipline that is required to multitask between a creative inclination and computer problems, for example. You need to have a certain amount of patience with that. But the discipline that I'm referring to is much more in terms of your own lifestyle. So I find that what allows me to be creatively productive is to set parameters for when I work and when I don't work. For example, 5 o'clock every day, I exercise. I go for a walk, or I do some mild resistance training or some yoga or something. And a lot of times the idea of dragging myself away from an idea just seems so absurd. Like, why would you leave this idea? But the reason why I force myself to is removing that sense of importance from your work allows you to relegate it to a place that's much healthier. And once it's relegated, then the preciousness is taken away from it. I think if you subscribe to that idea of being an artist as being that romantic sense of, the crazy scientist alone in his lab scorning social interaction and his family because the music is so important, I think that's not only unhealthy on a psychological level, but I think it's counterproductive in terms of a creative level, because I think it's very easy to get so far into your own process that you're not able to have that the awareness to say, hey, this is just not a good song, or this is just not something that's in line with where I'm at. So I would suggest anybody who's in this quarantine, which is most of us, that if you're trying to find ways to really articulate yourself accurately, try and remove that sense of your art being the most important thing, not only to you, but to humanity. There's that sort of romantic vision too, that what I'm doing is so important that everything else can wait. See what happens when you let the music wait. I found a lot of inspiration from doing that.
Um, while we're still on vocals, I have a question here. Hold on, and now I've lost it. Yes, here we go from Graham. Graham wants to know, how do you work out the harmonies for your choir work, and how do you EQ and deal with the frequencies in so many voices?
I think a lot of that has to do with two things. I work out the harmonies. I've got a good mind for choral arrangements. That's been something that I feel is an attribute. When I was in school, the majority of my compositional learning came from being in choirs and singing Handel's Messiah, for one, and having an interest in avant-garde sort of modern classical composition that was really based in Star Wars. When you listen to the scene in that first Star Wars movie where they're on the sand planet, I forget, the sand people thing. Not being a huge Star Wars fan, but of course knowing it. At the time, I didn't recognize that a lot of the music that came from that was really rooted in Rite of Spring and Stravinsky, and then also West Side Story with Leonard Bernstein and all those things. It became so ingrained in my DNA that when I learned how choral music was written and the structures in which baritone, bass, alto, soprano, tenor, all these things worked, when I'm writing choral arrangements now, I basically record my voice and then I stop and I listen to it. I'll loop a section, I'll listen to it, and I listen to what's already there. And without trying to write harmonies, eventually things become obvious. And that path of least resistance is how I write them. In terms of recording them, I tend to do mic choice for one. Certain frequency ranges, I know when I do screaming vocals, I know that the frequency range of a tube microphone is going to be unpleasant compared to something like an SM7 that takes distorted frequencies and sort of automatically compresses them in a way that doesn't highlight that sort of 3.5K. However, that same frequency range that I'm trying to avoid with that screaming vocal is something that I can accentuate at a different, in a different vocal part, in a lower vocal part. If you look at the frequency range as being congruent with a scale, you'll see that lower notes are at a certain, if you look at an EQ, when you sing a lower note, it's going to resonate at a certain pitch. It's going to resonate. That pitch is going to have a frequency. So if you're putting together multiple vocals, you're going to want to do some analysis with the frequency range as well and say, okay, well, there's a lot of energy in C. I tend to write a lot in C. So if I've got a major chord, a C major chord, and I know that the bass is doing the root and then the soprano is doing several octaves up of that, I know there's going to be a lot of energy in C. So the fifth is something I can get away with the same microphone or the same EQ curve. But you just go through and you start to dip them. So when you're on when you're looking at it, if it is a frequency range, all those things end up sort of having room for each other, right?
Right.
And compression as well is really important to me for vocals. Really important to me.
So while we're talking about compression and EQ, one of the things I see there is the Shep's Omni channel on one of your choir tracks.
Mm-hmm.
How do you go about using something like that? I mean, obviously you've got the gate in, the preamp, the EQ, the de-esser, and the compressor. It's like, which parts of that do you start with when you're working with something like this channel strip?
Well, what's interesting, and which is something that is tremendously important to me at this point, is the presets that get provided with plugins. I've just been so well thought out for the most part, and this one, of course, is got a load of them as well. Obviously, you go into these, and there's all these artists who have made presets. So I typically start by just finding something that seems like it's in line with what it is I'm trying to achieve. So this one, I just found a preset somewhere by looking through it that was a vocal stack, background vocal stack. And I started with that. And I may have done a couple of tweaks to it that were just based on feel. But a lot of how I use plugins is I rely on the work that other people have done to be a starting point for me. And to be fair, this particular plugin I use not only in this case for the background stacks, but there's a couple of things that I've happened across that I find super useful. The one that I default to in this is under Andrew Shep's radio. That one there. I use that a ton because there's a sort of filtered effect that I have in the past tried to achieve that requires, compression and scooping out the low and the high end and hitting those mid frequencies and then compressing the crap out of it. And I used to do that manually, but this one I'm like, hey, that works great. So I tend to skip to that.
One of my favorite things about this specific plugin is, and for those of you who are watching this and are huge fans of Devin's, but are also new to mixing and production, you'll see in the middle of this plugin that some of the knobs and the rotaries are blue. There's a little part of this plugin up the top that says focus. And when focus is on, what it does is the artist who created those presets highlighted which were the most relevant parts of the plugin to adjust in this specific preset. So it's a bit like having, as Devin said, presets, somebody else has done all the work. They're doing even more work for you by helping you work out which tweaks you should do to get the most out of this specific preset.
Which I think is a great way to start. And
Yeah.
We were first doing this. I'm sure you and I have been doing this for a similar amount of time, and we were back in studios with the hardware. And before any of this,
Yeah.
there was a real aspect of the chosen few that had these techniques that oftentimes were reticent to share. And so if you learned how to do a certain gating trick, or you learned how to do that, I remember gating guitars was this crazy thing where you took a DI and then you put it through an expander, and then and it was a pain. So now to be able to have something like this where you're just like, okay, so this is how it starts. And again, with the blue, in order to be able to emphasize the parts of that preset that make sense for why it's important to you in the first place, there's the 5 knobs that do more or less of that effect. It's been fantastic.
Yeah. I also love the fact with this specific that specific plugin that you can move the different sections of it around. You can drag and drop them or insert a plugin as well. So, yeah, I love that plugin.
It's the amount of options. Now, this is something that I think is worth discussing as well. I think a lot of times what we also need to be wary of when we're making productions is the amount of options that we're now presented. So I tend to default to certain things for a number of reasons. It can be for CPU usage, it can be for familiarity, it can be for a number of things. And I'm very fortunate to be working with Waves and to have all of these fantastic plugins. However, option anxiety is something that I see a lot of people, whether or not they're advanced in their productions, or more often than not in the beginning stages of learning how to do this, that open up these plugins and they see all these presets and they're like, where does one even start? But I think that you start, as a suggestion, with, as I do, finding something that in the descriptor of what the preset is sort of applies to what you're looking for: lead vocal, heavy guitar, whatever. And all these presets for any of these plugins tend to be put into those sorts of categories. And then try not to think about it as being perfect or not. I think that again, I'm going to say old adage 1,000 times in this, of the perfect being the enemy of the good, is very important to keep in mind. I think you can get lost in it to the point where you're no longer creating music. You're just trying to pursue this unobtainable goal.
Yeah, and also you dig yourself into a hole that you can't get out of without literally ripping everything apart and starting again, which is, that's frustrating as hell.
I would say, though, that if that happens, or if that becomes something that seems to be the only option, that's
Probably
a huge
is.
part of learning.
Yeah.
Like just knowing when to quit and knowing when not to quit comes from failing.
I have a question here from Marius. Could you please outline your approach to balance out your beautiful vocal variety, in brackets, scream, soft head voice, full voice, etc., recording and mix wise, and how you balance those in a mix when there's so much extreme going on?
Well, let's look. So basically, so you see here that I've got a lot of vocals 1, vocals 2, certain words, like, and it's been a while, it's been a year since I've looked at this session, so I'm going to have to sort of listen through. This one says always. So that, for example, is a very filtered, and very affected vocal. So what I might do in that situation is, if the lead vocal, which I'm certain somewhere in here there is a lead vocal saying always, but that part's in effect. But I'll have all these vocal tracks. You see them all. And there's just stacks and stacks of vocals. Let's look at something that's deep here. Let's see what we got here. And what I will typically do is, to make it easier on myself, you'll see at the end here, I've got these 3 stereo tracks that represent another massive session. So if I was to solo just Bolero tune. Now you'll hear in that a very nasal quality. Now that was intentional as well. So as opposed to singing it like, I was like, like consciously while I was singing, I made my tone frequency-wise different. And the reason I did that was not foresight. I wish it was, then I could claim it as being clever. But what it actually was is, as I was listening through to this track, so let me mute these. The ending was supposed to be the climax. So when I'm listening, and a lot of times when I'm mixing and recording, my volume is really low. I felt like there was something missing at a certain frequency range. So by adding these, here's without, here's with.
No, I'm here.
So here's without, here's with. It's incredibly subtle. But this incredibly subtle effect took hours. Here's without. Here's with.
Yeah, it is very subtle. It's very subtle.
Then I also added to that a screaming vocal. And the death, there it says death, spelt phonetically. I always do that. Is this. Always. So together. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to mute all the vocals, and we'll start one at a time, just to sort of give you an idea of what is going on throughout this entire section. Is that all right?
That's fine with me. I don't know about you guys, but I'm enjoying this.
Okay, so no vocals. And that in and of itself is a huge amount of production. The most important part of that is the synth for me, but that's sort of neither here nor there. Let's see what we do with this one. What's this guy here? Okay, that's me replicating the sopranos. And then what are these two here? Double and double two. Let's see what this does. So together, double vocal effect. Okay, so this one here looks like it's just punctuations. Okay, so that's a always. I did that sort of thing with the voice. This one at the end here, let's see what this adds to it. Okay, that adds the chaos. And if I was to do that again, I would get rid of some 250 in that. But for right now, let's leave it. This here. Right, I'm going to loop this, make this a little easier. And this guy. guy. Then the deaths. And then the high scream. And then this guy. And then we got this too. What are these guys? And then we've got these which look like punctuations. And then vocal print. So here's an entirely different session down here. So let's see how this one fits in. Okay, that's an affected version. Okay. So now the vocal effects. So the vocal effects here. So I print the effects. Like I might make like an auxiliary, but I'll print the auxiliary so I have control over it. So let's listen to what just the effects are doing. Okay, so that's that guy again. Now we have a full women's choir down here as well. Of course we do. Why wouldn't we? So here, let's see. Now, why is that not coming through? Minus 15.
Sounds like my alarm clock right now.
That's it. You should put it as your ringtone. Let's see if this is actually in. Okay, that's going somewhere else. Okay, so
hey, while you're looking for that, somebody Zhao is asking. He says I'm at the 157 mark, and other places. What's that kind of rattlesnake sound? I'm like, rattlesnake?
Oh yeah. So that is that's an artifact from tuning. So basically, when it comes down to a part that's as dense as this, it's really important for me. I use techniques to get all the vocals, the transients, the S's and the T's lined up, and then I tune them. And I tune them really heavily in these sections as well, because when you're also trying to EQ this, the fluctuations of tuning with 150 vocals can be such that you just throw the whole thing out of whack. So what you heard there is an artifact that I made the decision while I was doing it. I was like, that's not going to bother me in the mix. So let's see if I can find that. It's like a little...
It's like a glitch.
Yeah, it's a glitch.
Yeah. I actually like it.
Yeah, same.
For what it's worth.
Yeah, same. And it's another one of those things where I've been doing it long enough that I also know what's going to be heard as a problem in the mix versus what's acceptable. And it's probably the first time anybody's recognized it. So we're good.
Well, go Zhao. So a question for you. I'm noticing a lot of C1s and a lot of Renaissance DSs. Are those kind of like your go-tos?
The RDSer has been my go-to for years, and I see now that it's got a new interface. And so it used to be this blue and black one, right? But yeah, I tend to use certain plugins as a default, and the RDSer is one. I don't think I've ever touched any of this stuff. The only thing I've ever touched is these two. Yeah. And basically, I just go really lightly with all these things. I'm just looking for it just to sort of touch it, right? See how that's on the S's and the T's.
Yeah.
And I use that everywhere. Another one that I've used forever actually is, and I'll give you an example of it as just a drag and drop one. It's this plugin called VComp, right? So if you go down to this, it's down the bottom, is it not? Okay, so VComp, this guy here. So I use this. I don't even know a lot of what it does, but I'll show you what I use it for. So here it is without it. And then I add it. In this case, it does nothing. Sorry. How I tend to use it, though, is I put the default onto a single track. Maybe it's because it's stereo, and it just makes it sound better. And that's one of the plugins that does so. The RDSer is the one I just drop straight into it. And the C1 is just a great compressor. It's just an easy-to-use compressor that I drop down. I think a lot of my process is the least that I have to do to it. The more that the EQ and the compression can be done either prior to the mix, printed down, or not at all. It's important. Even if you look at my bus, It's the SSL comp, but it's just basically catching the transients.
We have a couple of questions about the bus, yeah. So if you want to go into that, we can do that.
Sure. So I've got a compressor that just basically catches, the top end of it. It is almost, see, it basically is hardly on. And then I run it into this that just sort of catches the snare. And then at the very end, I use this. What's great about this one actually is Stanley, the guy who does live sound for me.
Stanley Suarez, yeah.
Stanley Suarez. He's got all these presets. And live, he's just an incredible sound man. And I keep asking him, I'm like, how do you do that? How do you do that one thing? And he tells me, and I don't get it. I'm like, oh, okay. I pretend I get it, and I walk away confused. But with this, he made all these presets that I know he uses for his live, right? Like the bus and all this. And the one that I use for my master is called Lift. And so basically, again, let's see how I can. All right. So without it. Find a part here that is. Wait a second. Without it. And with it. Without it. With it. So how this it's got this presence, which is crystalline. Love that one.
I like the spreader too. It's like sometimes a bit of that spreader is amazing.
I use the spreader on keyboards because it kind of gives like a mid-side kind of vibe to it. So check it out. If I was to spread the whole mix with it. Straight up. But I use this one typically for, like, it's almost like a finisher. It's like, if I want to add more high end, it's got that like 12 to 16 or wherever it's voiced, maybe a little higher. But it doesn't seem to be like a harsh frequency.
No.
And then, well, we've got these kind of, oh wait, no wonder. I'm sorry. I was wondering why I didn't do anything. 2 seconds. There we go. Sorry. Without, with. Sorry, that was my fault.
It's all good.
Turn down the 3. There we go. Okay.
Plugin does so much, but it can sound so subtle at the same time.
I think the biggest thing about my production and mixing technique is it's all really, really subtle. And in fact, when I've worked with people in the past, because it takes me forever to do these things too, like these mixes are the product of just huge amounts of session, huge amounts of data. And when I've worked with people in the past, there's this, I use a big bell curve, and I don't hear it until it's 1 dB or 2 dB difference. But my work is 0.2 dB. That's kind of the intervals that I mix in. And it comes down to, even on the master bus, you'll see that I've automated the master bus throughout it too. Just little bits, just to kind of smooth things out. Like if you listen to this section, I've got this little curve here. There. And so that hit on the samples there, right there.
Yeah.
I wanted the cat, which is in there clearly, to let's see, is the cat here? Yeah. So I wanted the cat to be small, and then it gets big again, right? So I found the best way for me to do that was to feed the bus chain with this small, like right there, if we go to the samples, in my automation, what I have probably done in a number of cases, if I go to pan, let's just see if I'm correct or not. Did I do any automation of the panning in this session? No, I didn't. But what I did was I printed the panning so that when it, right before it went to the da da dun dun, the whole frequency range goes to the middle. And I would, in the case of this, here you see how I've got this crossfade here. Let's hear what that's doing. Yeah. So what I do with that, here's a good example of the process. I'll replicate it, even though it's not a musical example, like this here, crazy violins. Let's make an example of this. Okay. So if I wanted that effect to transition into something else, what I will do is I will take this, not the whole process, not the whole waveform, but I'll take this much, and I'll go up to modulation, and I default to this one called Metafilter. And check this out. This is my process. I loop it.
I love this plugin.
So I loop it by hitting this. And then I just...
We're not gonna hear that, by the way, because that's monitoring somewhere else. Because remember, that doesn't go through the string to us.
You can't hear it, but I'll just do it, and then you will hear it. Let's take this one randomly. Let's do it. Okay, and then I render it because I'm hearing it, and it's a million dB. All right, so I basically scroll through it until I find something that I find intriguing, and so I just randomly chose this one. All right, that's what that filter did to it. But then how I transition it is I start from before and I do a crossfade all the way to there. And then when I play back, it does this. And it becomes that filter.
Right.
So in this case, what I wanted to do with this is I found, and it wasn't something I was looking for, I just scrolled through presets in the Metafilter there. I found something that did a combination of what I guess could be described as a filter, like a EQ filter, and also it seemed to put the panning in a different place. And I just did that effect that I just showed you, that technique. Right there.
Awesome. That's awesome.
And then when I finally put all this stuff together, and this is all just having fun. I can't stress enough that the process of creativity for me is not anything other than just exploration. You know, I had a submarine in there. In fact, let's go through this section. I think that would be great. So let's go to here. So we've got an explosion. We've got this filter thing. We've got crazy violins. Let's see what else we got. We got some weird sample here, whatever this is. Let's see what this guy is. Super quiet, but...
Do you find that you sometimes even go, oh my god, I forgot I put that in that session?
Of course, yeah. But I think it's like, it's past dev doing future dev of Solid, you know? I do the same thing when I'm trying to clean my room. I'll put things in a place and label them, so when I'm looking for them later, I'm like, hey, I was looking for my passport, and here's a drawer that in my handwriting says passport.
We have a few people asking, where was the last guy? So I can, yeah, Matt was the last one who said he's curious about the Ableton track. It's like,
Sure. So this song started with Ableton. So that is going back to one of our original questions about how did the song start. I was jamming with Ableton. And it wasn't with any objective. And then I took that jam, I exported it into stems, put it into Pro Tools, just those stems and the tempo, and I just messed with it further. And then when I finally got to something that I thought was reasonably interesting, I printed it as a stereo track, and so...
I'm curious what Brow Motion was doing on it.
Brow Motion, I think I've got it automated, I do. So... Another way that I find space within a mix is by panning. That's like a huge part of it. It's recently I had the great fortune of being able to do my mix in 5.1, and then there was a lot more real estate. But until such time that type of technology is something that we're able to just provide for people immediately, you're still stuck with left and right. And it's one thing to say, okay, this is in the center, this is 13 to the left, this is 100, 100, this is 30, 30, or whatever. But you're still running out of room really quick the more that these ideas start to present themselves. So how I find room for it is by automating panning. So this brower motion here. So this is a really cool plugin. There was one that I used in the past. I think it was called Auto Panner, and it was all right. But this here gives me the opportunity to do anything with the panning. So as I'm going through this, you can control, this one and the back and forth of it and another thing. So in this situation, it's muted. So here's where it's okay. So that effect there allows me, in a place where it's getting really dense musically, I can see if you can hear it in here. I got it accentuated here. So what it does in my headphones is it gives me this kind of subconscious sense of movement. And a lot of times the subtlety of the work is more directly involved with the sort of subconscious awareness of something. So in that sense, while I was mixing, I was thinking, okay, I want to have a feeling of impending chaos, which is the next section. In my mind, it was a satellite falling from the universe into the ocean. So during that
happens all the time.
Does. And so the idea is to have that sort of movement going on. So it's like this sense that, okay, something's happening. So when it does crash, in my headphones right now, I hear this. So here it goes. Now it starts to move because I had it automated starting here. And then it falls. Falls in the ocean. So there's a submarine, and then when it surfaces, seagulls. So the whole idea with what I'm trying to do production-wise is to illustrate an internal vision, but that vision isn't preconceived. I think there's this sense that when you finally hear something like this in its completion, you think, well, whoever created this song knew from the beginning there's going to be cats and seagulls and what have you. It wasn't. I was just bored, and I'm recording, and I'm like, clearly there should be seagulls here. Clearly there should be a cat here.
My friend, your music is the kind of music that makes me miss album art and album stories, where I can open up the LP and really read about the process. It's like your music is an adventure.
Well, that's real. Thank you. Number one, thank you. But I still do that. I start the artwork for these albums at a year before. I've got 3 artworks currently in progress for albums that are probably not going to come out for another 5 years. It's like the experience of it is really important to me because it gives you a place to explore, I guess.
I got a question here from Dashaust, who says, "Hi, I'm another great fan. How important is tape saturation or using it on the master chain, and do you use it often?"
I do if the songs are simpler, which is rare. But I think I have to be very careful with compression, limiting, and saturation when it comes to my master bus, because you've got such a limited frequency range, really. And a lot of the things that I'm trying to achieve here can be thwarted by what is typically known as being, well, that's how you get a good crack out of the snare. That's how you get a good, that's how you get that low end solidity in combination with the kick drum. A lot of those techniques end up compromising the frequency range, specifically in the high mids. And as much as I'm able to do a lot of different voices, the inherent quality of my voice exists in that kind of 3.5K area, which is the same place as a lot of the cymbals, same place as the orchestra, same place as a lot of the synths. And so tape saturation a lot of times when it does that really cool breakup, it also does it in a similar frequency range. So I got to be really careful with that, to be honest. And that brings me also to the orchestra. If you look at, I've got during this, I've got choirs and I've also got orchestras in here too, right? I've got all sorts of, here's all the orchestra tracks. So amidst all this stuff, we've got, or, we had these poor people in I think it was Kiev that did all the orchestral stuff for me, and I also have this full women's choir, and they're all existing at that same frequency range. And unfortunately, that lovely tape saturation, in my experience, also sort of accentuates. So I got to be careful with it, right? Like,
I have a question.
sure.
How long do you spend on, you just mentioned the orchestra in Kiev. How long do you spend on the scoring for that instrument, for that orchestra? And what part of that process is the writing of the composition? Because obviously something like Evermore has so much more to it than just, the orchestra, just anything, because it's so much. What part of the writing process is the scoring for the orchestra?
It's prior to any recording. So now I realized why there was a problem there. Okay, so here's the choir, which they're beautiful, amazing choir. However, in the room that was lovely, the S's were also a nightmare. Like always searching was a nightmare. Like see, because the S's are like right, and that's kind of unavoidable. Sorry, that's a sideline to your question. So prior to recording, I do very elaborate demos. So the demos, the final session here that we're listening to was also the demo, and I just keep evolving it. And so if I go into my muted tracks, like this is everything from the beginning. Like look at all this crap over here. You know what I mean? It's just it's immense amounts of stuff. But that's because as the session progresses, I'll do submixes and then mute all that stuff on the side. And once the demo is at a point where I'm satisfied that the song has potential, one of the first things I do, and this is just based on years of doing this, is I immediately start to delegate the orchestras and choirs to people who speak that language more fluently than I. Not on a compositional level, but on an arrangement level. I want it to be written out. I want the sheet music. I want the choirs and the orchestral players to not have any questions about it. And so I'll hire people to take my vocal and I'll say, this is the vocal part, this is the tempo, this is the backing track. Can you take this and then relegate those harmonies to the appropriate section? And I'll do the same thing with the orchestra. I'll do virtual orchestras and then give it to an orchestrator and say, okay, can you put this in a place where the violas are playing what notes are within their register versus the string pad that I've made, right? And that happens prior to recording the drums, prior to recording anything. It's like really early in the process.
Well, that answers a few questions from people who were saying what software orchestras you use. So you use a mixture of that plus real live people.
Yeah. So if I may, I'm sorry to interrupt.
It's your show, dude.
I run two systems simultaneously. Pro Tools, I do the majority of my mixing for a number of reasons. One, I'm fluent, but two, I find that still, although it is changing, the majority of the studios that I choose to work in, that's their main platform, and it has been for a long time. So it's important for me to be fluent in it. However, a lot of my compositional work is done in Logic. And all my orchestration is done in Logic, and I use a combination of Spitfire and Cinesamples for that.
Right.
And Ableton as well, right? And then it all migrates over here eventually for the mixing stage.
I see on the choir you're using some APIs, which obviously I love because of their fixed frequencies and how clean they are. Do you tend to? One of the questions that's come up a bit is how do you manage to make all of this orchestration fit with the huge amount of guitars and have them both present?
I'm bald,
right? Yeah.
That's the only way you can do it, man, is just pulling your hair out. I mean, I will say that I've been doing this for a long time, and a lot of what I do now is rooted in some degree of theory. But in a similar way to my voice, similar way to my guitar, production, engineering, and mixing, I never learnt. I just mess around with it. And I think one of the most important steps that I ever took was committing to putting out records that didn't sound great, but doing it myself. And there was a number of reasons that started that. In the beginning, I didn't have the backing to be able to sort of articulate it in the ways that I'm fortunate to be able to now, to a certain degree. So there was some necessity involved with that. But I also thought that the only way I'm going to learn is to do my best, and if it doesn't end up being perfect, it's still the best you could do. So albums like Infinity from years ago or Synkestra, which I mixed, those were my first mixes. In hindsight, don't sound great to me. But by doing it and putting it out there, perhaps my ego is just so much. I was like, well, I got to get it better next time. I got to get it better next time. And so I learned over the years, for example, with API, that there's certain frequencies that the API does really well. This one I use because it's these fixed ones, and I can count on the transparency of this one at this sort of 250 range, 500, to be able to deliver something that's easy for me to achieve, right? However, what API also does great, and I'll just bring this other one up here as an example, is this one frequency that I just love. That's the same one, and show's over. Good night. Let's see, which one is it? It's not that one. It's not that one either. There's three.
It's the 550B.
Yes, because that's the last option. Yeah. So this one here, the 40 on this one is awesome. It's for low end, for the kick drums, there's something about that particular EQ and that particular frequency that I just love, right? So the API stuff and all these plugins, I end up sort of defaulting to them, having had success with them in the past. And I sort of say, okay, I know that this one is really efficient for scooping this or boosting this or dropping this on and quickly moving on. And again, going back to the beginning, it's important for me to be left brain, right brain, so I can have the discipline to be able to remember these things. But with that comes a certain amount of randomness that, although may appear to be haphazard, without it, I couldn't create this stuff. Right. So it's a balancing act of discipline and being a child, I guess.
I think you've got to be a child. I mean, you've got to have a certain kind of youth in your brain to come up with anything creative. I think in a lot of cases. So
with that childish thing, though, also comes I don't wanna, which also plays into my process a lot. People are like, well, if we scroll through this, we might be able to find something a little better. And I'm like, I don't want. I just want to move on.
So one of the questions coming up a lot is, do you deal with your multiple variants of guitars from screaming to quiet the same way as you deal with your vocals?
Yes. Yeah, so I'll go through that now. Just give me a second, all right? I just gotta open this.
What were you opening?
Things get a little warm in the gear department of Chateau Dev here. Sometimes
there you go.
Cool it down. So yes, conceptually, I do deal with it the same way. However, in practice, I've found ways to make it a little quicker for myself. So I run everything AES. So I've got an AXFX3, an AXFX2, a Kemper, and some DSP ones. I did some presets for the Paul Reed Smith thing and a couple other things too. And these are all really cool, but they all serve very specific functions for me in terms of making layers. And how I've made the guitar sounds to begin with is I do all the EQ within the plugins, within the digital gear, so that I know that when I'm going to it, I know that this one fits with that one and this one fits with that one. So what would be an example of that? So the greenies here are my guitars. So let me just see where we're at. And a lot of what I do as well is I add synths to guitars and keep the guitars clean, because I find that the distortion of synths is much easier frequency wise to handle than a distorted guitar. Distorted guitars and cymbals are just the bane of my existence, because they all, again, the distortion of the guitars, the frequency of those cymbals, they're at the same place as the orchestras and my voice and the synths and all that stuff. And it just, ugh. So there's my guitar sound. It's clean, right?
It's very clean.
Totally. But what I've got added to that, so in the bass, which is cool. But then when I go to the actual distortion of this part, at least, let's see. Ableton. Yeah, so here, check this out. But because this was the last chorus, so I've got the orchestras. Because this is the last chorus, so this is the amount of guitars I have in the beginning. By the time we get to the end, I added some distorted guitars. But I also know that, for example, that clean guitar, there's a hole in it in the low mids, right? And so I can fill it in with that, which is an octave below. And this is, which is slightly lot more distorted. Then I use digital ones. You see, I cut them all up. They're just all like chunks, right? Because their function is more just to, add support. But that digital, well, not digital, but just distortion in general, it's got this chaotic frequency that, unless it's super tight, gets in the way of everything. So I cut that up. But I didn't like that sound on its own, so I put a real amp. Then, for example, the ending. This. That was a mistake that had happened because I was sending the entire mix. It was a mistake. I was sending it to a tape delay, but I loved the effect of it. So before I changed it, I took one of these available tracks. If you see, they're just labeled arbitrarily, samples 1, samples 2, blah, 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 blah. And then I just printed the entire mix to this. So I could still use that. And I love the effect of the whole mix ending with that. Right? So the whole process is it's a lot of it is just feel and taking it slow too, right? Like the edits, for example, with the vocals or with the bass or with the drums. A lot of the times you get so impatient with it because you just want to hear the song. It's growing in your head, but the random firing off happens in the demo process, and then all the rest of the process is about refining what may have taken a day. Like I could just go in there and I'll be, it's got an orchestra and it's got a bunch of guitars and it's got drums and it's got vocals and I hammer those down. And the demo phases of this it's ugly. It's like tracks are everywhere and there's no rhyme or reason to it. There's a vocal after the snare and it's just a mess, right? But then to get it to the point where you can start to really bring it out, it's about then sort of taking a step back, putting your brain into that other side of the logical process, organizing your sessions, and then going through it one at a time and saying, okay, this edit, this particular part, this frequency, this instrument, and just cleaning it, right?
So how I don't even know how to say this, because it's like, guys and girls, this is a masterclass in dynamic range here, because this is Devin is a master at it. How do you deal with managing that you don't go deaf with this? Because it's like this music, because this music, obviously, it's like it sounds really good to play it loud. I mean, when you're mixing, at what level are you kind of like managing the volume so that you can actually hear everything that's going on here?
Well, I think with every that's again, thank you for the compliments.
Just
I think,
facts, my friend, just facts.
man, I think that I think that everything I do, you have to ride that line between rational and irrational. And I think that I often when people are like, oh, you play prog, I'm like, you take that back. You know what I mean? It's like there's a part of me that feels that the reserve and the restraint that comes from what is typically known as that sort of intellectual side of your brain musically is something that I can only do for a certain amount of time before I just get bored, right? So I listen to things quietly until I pin it, and then I'll go to bed with my hearing just fucked for days. And I also feel okay. So I'm 48 years old now. At best, I've maybe got another 40, 45 years at best, and it could be another 10 minutes. Who knows? And I feel that we're given a certain amount of hearing and a certain amount of life and a certain amount of energy. And I just spend certain amounts of it sometimes. Sometimes I'm like, I'm going to listen to things so loud for so long that by the time the record's over, I'm like, well, I'm 3% less able to hear than I was in the beginning. But I felt it was a worthy investment, man. So I keep it quiet until I don't.
It's a very good answer. So I mean, one of the last questions I want to ask before we roll this up is clearly there's a lot of people out there who are huge fans of yours, and I'm one of them. But you're also, regardless of the artist part, you're a master of the way you mix and what's audible in that mix. If you had to, if you had a chance to give one piece of advice to, and I'm looking at two different cameras here because you're in one and everybody else is in the other. If you had a chance to give people one piece of advice on how to get to the level that you've achieved so far, from where they are in bedrooms and wherever we are around the world, what would it be?
I'll say two things. First, thank you again. I'm nowhere near where I want to be. Nowhere near. I have struggled for many years thinking that I wasn't able to talk about this process because I'm sure you've encountered this sort of audio elitism that a lot of times you may run into with people who really know what they're doing. And I was really insecure about that for a long time. People were saying, well, you can't do it that way. I remember when I first started, when I was 18, I went to talk to a local producer in Vancouver, and he's like, well, what's your vision? I'm like, well, I want to take Metallica, Enya, and Def Leppard and put it all together. You know what I mean? With a little bit of Stravinsky in there just because I want to pretend like I understand it. And they were like, well, that's not possible. You can't do that. And I remember thinking, of course you can. You just got to figure out how to. But the process of me getting to the point where even where I'm at now, where, yeah, I mean, I listen to Empath and I think it's good, but man, it could be so much better, so much better. And I think the 5.1 sounds great, but it can still be so much better. And I learn each time. And the way that I got to that point was by allowing myself to do the best that I could, have it considered in some people's eyes a failure, and then moving on anyway. The biggest possible piece of advice I can give to people is learn how to fail efficiently. Learn how to. So I put out Empath, and there's all sorts of YouTube videos of engineers that are just picking it apart. And your first reaction to that is, I don't want to be criticized by people after spending huge amounts of time doing this. But the bottom line is, by doing things professionally, that's what happens. That's what happens. There is something that I felt I needed to get over, in that as soon as it leaves you, if other people are critical of it, that's an inevitability. And if you let that criticism affect your judgments or your process in a way that disallows you from continuing, then that's a huge impediment to the creative process. So I can offer a couple of practical ways to solve that. Don't read the comments, for one. And also use each album and every creative venture that you pursue as, look at it as a grade in high school. Okay, I'm in grade 5, and then the next album I'll be in grade 6, and then grade 7, and then maybe I get to go to college, and then maybe go to university. But if you consider that you're done, if you consider that you've made it perfect, then there's no reason to continue. I think that's also something to keep in mind. If I got it right, if I got Empath right, if I got any of these records, if I get this next record I'm doing right, then there's no more music. Like, why would you do it? If you get it perfect, it's like, why would you do anything other than having it perfect? And it's not going to be perfect. So again, the enemy of the good is perfection. So if you just consider your process as being a work in progress, as your life is, and every step of this ordeal of the technical sides of recording and what have you is also hand in hand with learning, accepting when you can do things better, and then also taking inspiration from people who are better than you at a lot of things. There's so many. For this one, I had a friend of mine, Nolly Getgood, record the drums for me because he's better than me at it. It wasn't about a competition. I want this to be the best it can be. And so the next time I know what went wrong with Empath. There's a bunch of things that now I'm through it. I'm like, oh, okay, well, next time I'm going to know this, and this, right? Learn to fail efficiently, and don't let the inevitable criticisms that come with music and art culture at this stage of, humanity's development prevent you from being bold enough to do it anyway.
I think you just wrote a book. Personally, that my friend is a book. So, Devin, my friend, I would like to thank you on behalf of Waves. I would like to thank you, everybody out there in Wavesland who have been watching this. Would like to thank you. I'm going to close this up. Please don't go away. I'll be right back with you. In the meantime, folks, you just had a masterclass from one of the world's best when it comes to composition, EQing, compression, mindset, volume, and letting everything be heard in the mix. And also one of the most humble, brilliant guys I've ever come across. So please take this. Take this and watch it back. If you're a student, please study this, because this truly was a masterclass of open sessions. I'll see you next week with another masterclass on the Waves Open Sessions. Everybody, much love. Stay safe out there. Take care.
Of all